Welcome to the Business Talk, a global podcast series that highlights distinguished faculty members and their impactful scholarly contributions. I'm Deepak, your host from India. We are honored to welcome Dr. John Quiggin, Professor of Economics at the University of Queensland, as our distinguished guest on Business Talk today. Before we get started, I would like to introduce today's guest. Dr. John Quiggin is a leading Australian economist and Professor of Economics at the University of Queensland. Widely recognized for his influential research and insightful commentary on national economic policy. A fellow of the Econometric Society and the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia, he is also affiliated with several other esteemed academic institutions worldwide. Over his distinguished career, Professor John has authored more than 1,500 publications, including 6 books and over 200 peer-reviewed journal articles. His scholarly contributions span decision theory, environmental and production economics, and the dynamics of economic growth. Beyond academia, his writing has shaped public debate on major policy issues such as climate change, privatization, employment, microeconomic reform, and the sustainable management of the Murray-Darling Basin. His book Economics in 2 Lessons, Why Markets Work So Well and Why They Can Fail So Badly, published by Princeton University Press, distills decades of economic thought into an accessible exploration of market function and failure. In today's episode, Professor John Quiggin joins us to unpack the central ideas from his acclaimed book, Economics in 2 Lessons. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. John Quiggin to the conversation. Professor John, it's a distinguished privilege to welcome you to Business Talk. We are grateful for you to accepting our invitation.
Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you. Professor Dr. Hazlitt's Economics in 1 Lesson claims that market prices capture the true cost of everything, while your first lesson similarly emphasizes that prices reflect and determine opportunity cost for consumers and producers. How far do you agree with Dr. Hazlitt's before your second lesson start to diverge?
Well, I think the idea of opportunity cost is crucial, that it's easy to say we want something, the price of it is what we have to give up to have that thing, the best alternative available to us. And a lot of political discussion shies away from this, tries to find ways that we can have something for nothing. The famous saying, there is no such thing as a free lunch, is one illustration of this. So in markets, you pay a price. In terms of your own personal choices, that's the opportunity cost. When you buy something, it's the price is the amount, the value of the price could have been spent on something else. What if you buy my book? You can't buy another book, and you can't buy a restaurant meal with the same money. And similarly, if someone is selling something, they're giving up that item and giving away the inputs they use to produce it, with their own labour or things they paid for, in return, of course, getting that price. So opportunity costs are crucial. That, I think, is the lesson I very much want to portray, and that's in some sense what Hazlitt's 1 lesson says, although he's slightly obscure about the way he presents it. So the big question is whether the price we get actually represents the true opportunity cost of something to society. That, I think, is the issue that where the second lesson comes in. We have in economics a bunch of both obvious arguments and very complex mathematical arguments to say that if we have perfectly competitive markets, an appropriate distribution of income, and a bunch of other conditions are satisfied, then market prices will indeed correspond to opportunity costs exactly. Those 2 lessons are really about why that isn't always the case.
Professor, the second lesson argues that market prices do not reflect all the opportunity cost we face as a society. Can you walk us through a concrete example where sticking only to the first lesson leads to a policy disaster?
Well, I think the big lesson and the one that really started this literature is pollution. So if I produce something in a factory and dump the waste in the river, or put smoke out of a smokestack, or, of course, more recently, emit carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and I don't pay for that, then the cost of the product, the cost to me of producing the product, and therefore the cost at which I can sell it is less than the cost to society as a whole, because it's other people who are paying the cost of that pollution, whether it's dirty water, smoke in the air, or globally the damage done to the climate, which we all have to live in.
Professor, you devote roughly one-third of the book to explaining why markets usually allocate resources efficiently, and two-thirds to showing how and why they fail. What does that distribution say about real-world balance between market success and market failure?
Well, it certainly says I'm paying attention to it. On the other hand, right at the beginning of Tolstoy's classic book, Anna Karenina, he says, all happy families are happy in the same way, all unhappy families are unhappy in their own way. So even I think somebody who took a different view of the balance to me to cover the issues has to first say here is essentially the one way in which markets function properly and deliver the things. Here are the many different ways that things can go wrong. That doesn't necessarily say that they mostly go wrong, merely that there are many different ways that this can happen.
Professor, you center the entire book on the idea of opportunity cost as the most intuitive way to teach modern economics. Why did you choose this gateway concept instead of more familiar textbook tools like supply and demand diagrams or general equilibrium models?
Well, I was actually influenced by the physicist Richard Feynman, who has a great book on quantum electrodynamics, a very slim book. And he says, and at least convinced me, it's easy to understand everything in this very abstract and complex topic if you understand the notion that what we call a particle is really a probability distribution over some outcomes. You can draw pictures that make it work. To actually make that into something operational requires years and years of mathematical study by people who are people of great genius, and we can't do that. And something similar, I think, is true in economics. If you want to be an economist, if you want, when the government says we're thinking of putting such and such a tax on salt, what will happen? You have to understand supply and demand. You have to understand elasticities. You have to understand all sorts of things. But from the point of view of the uh, of the ordinary person who wants to understand the issues, there's really two things going on. One is, for me, the opportunity cost of salt will increase, and I can react to that by using less of it. I don't need to draw a demand and supply curve to say that. The second is to ask the question, well, why are we doing this? Why was this particular policy chosen? What was wrong with the price beforehand? Uh, that's um, uh, and that's a question that can have a lot of different answers.
Professor, many readers encounter opportunity cost as a simple classroom definition. In your book, you refine it further for society-wide decisions. How should we adjust the way we teach opportunity cost to students, policymakers, and the general public in light of your two lessons framing?
Well, I think, as I say, I think that um, uh, the famous proverb, there ain't no such thing as a free lunch, I could perhaps quickly explain that it comes from a marketing custom in the United States, probably a century or so ago. Uh, a tavern selling beer would provide a free sandwich with the beer. Of course, the price of the sandwich was in the beer, and I imagine if you tried to just eat the sandwich and not drink very much beer, that you probably would not stay in the hotel very long. Um, and so the point was, it's not free; it's there in the price. And I think so. Part of this process is just to say, if it seems to be too good to be true, it is. So that's a first filter. That if you look at a political leader, they're promising and saying, here I've got this policy and it's going to give you and you some good stuff, and no one is going to pay for this. You think, well, unless you have discovered something, there are ways that this can be done. If you can, for example, import new technology or something, you might do this, but most of the time the answer is no, someone is going to be paying for it. So that's, I think, the kind of task that has. The second task, as I say, is then to qualify that and say we really need to pay attention to what that price is. Is it the right price or not? How can governments deliver things? And indeed, good government policy does in fact deliver a free lunch. It is possible, and a theoretical concept around this in the book, but a good government policy with appropriate redistribution can deliver improved outcomes for everybody. And so part of the story is, having said there ain't no such thing as a free lunch, I say no, there is such a thing as a free lunch.
Professor, a central theme of the second lesson is that externalities like pollution or the wider benefit of education are systematically underpriced or ignored by markets. What kind of government intervention do you see as the most consistent with your two-lesson approach? And where do you think government typically go wrong?
So economists looking at externalities really like prices. Unfortunately, no one else does very much. So we like the idea of either taxes or tradable rights as a way of responding to pollution problems. Where they've been tried, they've been hugely successful. As well, I give examples of sulfur dioxide coming out of electricity smokestacks in the US, but uh, a number of major world cities, London and New York, have imposed congestion pricing on people driving into the city. Every person who drives imposes an externality on every other person. Um, that's been subject to incredibly ferocious political resistance in most places until it's happened. And suddenly people realise, actually, this is really great. The people who were suffering, the pedestrians and people suffering the impact of congestion can see it's better. And the people for whom it's really important to come into the city find, oh, actually now I pay my money, I come in, and instead of crawling through the streets for an hour to get to my destination, I can do this because the people who placed a low value on coming into the city have decided to take the bus or to stay away or something of that kind. So it's one of these cases where when the policy's lasted long enough, people really like it, but the resistance is ferocious. We start thinking about the poor motorist who, for some reason, needs to drive into the city and how unfair it is that they should have to pay when almost certainly the vast majority of people driving into either London or New York are better off than the average person in those countries. But those kinds of objections are always made. So they, I think, the remedies that economists favour are price-based remedies because they can, in principle, say you're now paying the social opportunity cost of what you're doing. You're not only paying the cost of operating your car, but you're paying the cost of the road space, which is scarce, that you're using, that you're taking up that other people can't use.
Professor, you emphasize that in a second-base world, fixing one imperfection in isolation can actually make things worse. Could you share a policy example where well-intentioned market reform backfired because it didn't account for other imperfections in the system?
Well, if you think of both Australia and India have gone through processes of moving from a fairly controlled trade system to something much more like the free market, but it's not necessary that every step on this process was a good one. So if you find some particular industry and remove tariffs or restrictions on that industry, um, while leaving the others untouched, you actually can lead to a worse outcome than you started with. So that's the issue about sequencing of reform in that case. And probably it's the classic one in the second best story, that if you have, for example, a widespread regime of import tariffs and you want to get rid of them, you should do so in a proportional basis rather than, which happened in Australia, certainly what we saw was the government sort of picked all the relatively easy targets. The hard ones were the ones that already had a high level of protection, and they got even more protection, even as protection in general was declining. And so that was a process which didn't work well. We sort of eventually, well, these were really textiles and motor vehicles, and we don't do much of either of those anymore. But eventually, we managed the adjustment a bit better.
Professor, if you were to rewrite economics in two lessons for a post-pandemic and climate-constrained world, which chapters or examples would you most want to update, and what new case studies would you add to illustrate market failure today?
Well, certainly, I think the issue of vaccines and vaccine mandates is a great illustration. I mean, it's clear, uh, and indeed this was a very big policy dispute in Australia that we had a group of medical experts whose job it was to look at vaccines, and they looked at it solely from the point of view of the individual patient. And so what they said was, well, look, if you're a 20-year-old, COVID won't be too bad. Um, there's always some risk, so don't do it. And they didn't consider what an economist would mean. Say, well, what if you're a 20-year-old with an 80-year-old grandmother? Um, you might be fine, but you can pass the disease on to them. So I think that was and of course that dispute is still continuing, and it's a case where there isn't an obvious price choice other than to say let's give the vaccines away for free rather than, I mean, some places charge for them, but after that, if that's not sufficient, you need to think about compulsion or various sorts of intermediate sanctions on people who aren't willing to be vaccinated. So I think that was the biggest issue. I suppose the other point, which I do discuss a lot in the book, is that most of the discussion we've had so far is what's called microeconomics. That is, we're looking at particular goods in particular places. It's equally important that the macroeconomy, the aggregate economy, is functioning at full employment. And of course, that became a huge issue during the COVID pandemic. I actually started a book trying to write about this stuff during the pandemic, from lessons from the pandemic, but the virus moved faster than I did. So it was just things changed too fast for me to make that book work.
Professor, your book pushes back against both laissez-faire dogmatism and the reflexive assumption that the government can fix any problem. How can citizens and policymakers cultivate a more tool-action mindset when thinking about issues like climate policy, inequality, or digital monopolies?
That's a good question, of course. I suppose one we've been struggling about for a long time. We've seen, I guess, I would say, certainly in Australia, uh, a growth in an unthinking belief that government can fix everything, followed by an excessive counter-reaction, I think, from the 1980s onwards, and now a loss of belief. That kind of thing in my previous book, I called it market liberalism or neoliberalism. People have lost faith pretty much in that, but we're now sort of, I think our political process is kind of floundering, and that's happening, of course, in lots of places, that we no longer have the kind of faith in markets that I criticised as one lesson in economics, but we haven't really worked out well what are the best directions in which we can move. And of course, the digital economy being brand new is one of these things, especially because it's very much one where prices don't obviously correspond to anything. So we're talking on this show that will reach hopefully thousands of people who haven't paid anything to either of us. And the cost to us of adding extra people is zero. So there's, once we have made the talk, there's no opportunity cost at all in extending it. And that kind of problem is widespread. I mean, of course, it's a marvelous thing that all this knowledge can be spread now to anybody who has a mobile phone. You know, it's a hugely wonderful thing, but still, at some point, somebody has to keep us fed and housed, and so we can keep on talking. And that relationship is now very complicated. And governments have grappled with this in various ways, but not entirely successfully.
Professor John, to conclude this episode, I would like to end with a final question. The book has drawn thoughtful critics from across the ideological spectrum, including free market and heterodox economists. Which criticism have you found most intellectually useful, and have any of them led you to refine how you present the two lessons?
Well, I think the most important one, I guess, is that I didn't really, although I have written about this in the past, I didn't really explicitly respond in much detail to claims about government failure. I felt I covered it. The critics, unsurprisingly, didn't. I think that's the sort of main free market view. Heterodox views, well, clearly it's not a Marxist book, and I mean Marxism in economics has largely declined, I think, but it very much isn't in that framework. And so I think some critics in that thing would just say, look, this is just nibbling at the edges of bourgeois economics or something of that kind. The other issue where I've been involved a lot, and I don't really have time to cover it, is modern monetary theory, which you may have come across. So my view there is, correctly understood, it's a restatement of the kind of views we have here, But there's a big temptation to ignore opportunity cost. So a big temptation, and in other writings I've seen, oh, this is great. Once you understand that budget deficits are not evil in themselves, and that taxation exists essentially to bring aggregate demand in line with aggregate supply, it's easy to jump from that to say, look, we really want, shall we say, a full-scale university in every city in the country, and my MMT says we can do this and we don't have to raise taxes. And until the pandemic, the answer, of course, was until it raises inflation. But before the pandemic, we hadn't had any inflation for a long time. So the assumption was, well, we can forget about that until it happens. Now that it's happened, I think that version of modern monetary theory has lost favour. It's clear that if you do try and spend a lot of money or do try and allocate a lot of resources, and the economy doesn't have those resources, inflation will result.
Thank you, Professor John Quiggin, for sharing your time and insights with us today. Your clear explanations and thoughtful reflections have added immense value to this conversation, and I am sure our audience will benefit greatly from your perspectives. It has been a truly privilege to learn from you, your book, and we look forward to engaging with your work further in the future. Thank you once again.
Thank you for having me.